leaving people's lives at risks, and this is just making people get angry with it.
I assume you don't work for the NHS. I may be wrong, but I'm assuming you don't.
I don't work for the NHS, but
so
I
it's
work on the private sector.
Okay, it's how many more days you want these folk to go without pay when a deal has been put forward that, let's be candid, Layla, all of the unions bar one say it's a good deal and they're going to recommend it. So they would respectfully be closer to it than you or I. So I hear you're saying, no, carry on, get more money, nurses deserve more. If the unions are ready, surely that tells us all we need to know. Just briefly.
What is 5% in this time, Nick? What is 5%?
Well,
If they're gonna lose 3 or 4 days out of their work and secure more pay for the rest of few years to come, that's surely worth it.
But that's the big if, isn't it? And you're assuming then that another 3 or 4 days means a U-turn by the government, and I sense that the unions have done pretty well. But Layla, thank you. We'll try and fit in more calls. But I have to say farewell. You're travelling, so safe journey wherever you're going, because we must bring into the conversation on another aspect, something that's a very grave issue. Murderers with a history of coercive or controlling behaviour will face longer terms after the Ministry of Justice have unveiled legal reforms. So let's turn to Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, who joins me with more details. Good to have you on, Deputy Prime Minister. What exactly is this happening, and what has driven the change? Good morning to you.
Morning, Nick. Well, we published today the Wade Review, which looks at murder and homicide sentencing across the board. I'm going to respond fully in the summer because there are 17 recommendations, quite detailed. But I can tell you 3 things that we're going to change right now. In murder cases involving what's called coercive controlling behaviour, disproportionately men against women, if you like, the tortuous abuse that leads up to murder, we think the sentences should be increased. I'm going to introduce a statutory aggravating factor that could increase the sentences by anything up to 2 years or more. It will depend on the facts of the case and the court decides it. And we'll consult on a starting point of 25 years in those cases. I also want to respond to some of those horrific cases of what's called overkill. And you think of the cases of Ellie Gould and Poppy Devi Waterhouse. Again, in domestic murders, savage attacks that go well beyond the point of death, if I can put it like that. And we think, again, a statutory aggravating factor to increase the sentencing in those cases. And finally, in manslaughter cases, we think the sentencing is also too low, where there is the so-called rough sex defence, where in the course of sex and a particularly savage attack that leads to the death of the individual, again, normally almost always a woman, the perpetrator claiming consensual rough sex. The sentences in those kind of cases can be as low as 5 years. Personally, I think they should be more in the realm of a starting point of 8 to 12 years. Now, it's the Sentencing Council that decide these things, but I'll write to them asking them to look and assess the case for change. And in all of this, Nick, in these most brutal cases, I want the perpetrators to be behind bars for longer, and I want, frankly, the women in this country and the bereaved of the victims to know that the justice system is fully on their side.
You've outlined some horrific cases there, Deputy Prime Minister. How common are these sort of cases, and how common are these aggravating factors in the cases?
Well, it's interesting. In domestic abuse murders, around half of, and they're the larger proportion of them are, of course, men against women. Around half of them involve so-called coercive and controlling behaviour. And that tells you that often the point of murder is the culmination of a torturous, agonising set of abuse. And I think that should be reflected. The cases like Ellie Gould and Poppy Devi Waterhouse of overkill, something like 60% of domestic murders involve overkill. So I think it is very prevalent. It isn't just those cases, as awful as they are. And I think that the time behind bars should reflect that.
And just for listeners who are wrestling with that term, overkill, as Justice Secretary, just explain what that is.
Well, it's pretty grisly on a breakfast show, but it's, for example, if a perpetrator stabs a victim several times, they might then go on in a frenzied attack to a dozen or 20 or 30 more times, not just to the point of death but beyond. Right. And of course that's appalling and horrific for the victim, but also I think for the bereaved is agonising when it comes to the aftermath. And I think the full severity of that should be reflected better in sentencing.
While I have the benefit of you on the line, Deputy Prime Minister, can I put you another couple of points, and one very much with your Secretary of State for Justice hat on? Hopefully you have been made aware of the front page of one of your newspapers this morning, The Guardian. Britain's largest police force is riddled with deep-seated racism, sexism and homophobia and has failed to change despite numerous reviews urging it to do. This is the Casey report, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The report was commissioned after the murder by the former officer, I won't name him, who abducted, raped and murdered Sarah Everard. Is time up for the Met?
Look, I won't report on the Casey review until it's published, but what I would say, whether it's the Casey review or the brilliant work and a timely work that Commissioner Mark Rowley is doing within the Met to root out, if you like, the bad apples, to make sure the checking, the vetting is done as rigorously as people would expect, we will leave no stone unturned to make sure that the police in this country, and in particular in the Met, are protecting women, not posing a threat to women. And I think you can see from the policing reforms that we are pursuing right the way through to the sentencing reforms that I've outlined to you, how seriously we take protecting women and making sure that those that abuse them face the full force of the law.
But coming back to the Met, Justice Secretary, how many more negative headlines can they take?
Well, look, the vast majority of police officers, whether in the Met and elsewhere, do their job professionally, serve the country extremely well. But we've clearly got a problem in the Met. And the thing to do is to own that problem, take it, tackle it head on. And that's why the Casey review is so important. That's why the work that Commissioner Rowley is already doing is so important. And we can't duck it. And we can't pretend that this is purely an isolated officer or two. There's clearly practices that have been far too prevalent that we must face head on. And so the headlines will give you some sense of that. But what really matters is the reviews and then the action that we take consistently and across the board to give women the confidence that they can have and they must have in the police and all arms of the criminal justice system.
Should the taxes paid by my listeners, your constituents in Esher and Walton, and indeed people up and down the country, go towards paying for the wedding in jail for Levi Belfield, the serial killer who Millie Dowler was one of his victims, as has been reported?
Well, there's no question of taxpayers' money being used on some sort of celebration. But look,
there's a legal aid bid so he can have his marriage party.
Well, the legal aid for prisoners is subject to strict criteria. But let me just be crystal clear with you, Nick. I don't think it is appropriate. And I'm going to change the law. And we're committed to that. And I think particularly in that kind of case, I think a lot of people, and I know, Nick, your listeners will find it an affront to the basic system of criminal justice. But I also think there's a question around the risk to anyone that would marry an offender as egregious as in this case Levi Belfield, and what we protectively do to make sure that they aren't subject or vulnerable people aren't subject to that element of risk. So on both factors, I'm committed to doing what we can to prevent that taking place.
But you won't be able to move swiftly enough to stop this potential marriage, will you, Secretary of State?
Well, it hasn't happened yet, and I plan to move quickly.
So you will try and block it?
Well, the passing law is never about any individual case, but I don't think it is appropriate, and therefore both within the realm of the existing powers I have, but also the legislative agenda, on which I'll be saying more shortly, I think it is wrong.
Lastly, it would appear that we have a breakthrough with the health workers. All but one union seem to be signing off on the deal. Can we see this possibly? I don't need to remind you, there are other public sector workers such as teachers, university lecturers and others who are still in dispute. Is this possibly the start of the wave that we can look at peace breaking out across the land? Dominic, Deputy Prime Minister?
I hope so, Nick. Look, there's obviously had to be compromise on all sides. I think the Health Secretary's done a very good job in staying calm and focused and trying to get this resolved. I think it's good news that the vast majority of the health service unions are accepting it. I hope the remaining ones will look at this seriously. We've obviously tried to strike the right balance. On the one hand, fairness. We know they do an amazing job. We want the lowest paid in our society, particularly in our public services, to be properly remunerated. At the same time, we've got to do things that are affordable and protect ourselves from and protect them from inflation going up. I think you can see with the budget this week that we're doing that, but also with inflation forecasted to come from its peak of 11% to 2.9% in 2023, that the plan that the Prime Minister has brought forward is working.
Grateful for your time today. Thank you. Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister and indeed Justice Secretary, appearing here on LBC. A little late to the news, 3 minutes after 8. Headlines, Lottie Morley.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, junior doctors in England are being encouraged